Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Puck introduced, we're going to talk about UI and UX and outsourcing, and it's going to be a great conversation with our amazing panelists. We have Gwen, Sarah, and Tristan, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves with a question so we can set some context for the conversation. Where are you coming from in terms of where are you working, and what does homegrown mean to you? And Sarah, do you mind starting us off?
Hi, I'm Sarah Dugan. I have a background in engineering, program, and product management, and I have worked in a variety of consumer product companies in Boston, so Shark Ninja, Owl Labs, and I'm currently a product manager at Suvi. Suvi is a startup in Cambridge where we save you time and help you eat better through our hardware kitchen countertop robot that also is paired with a meal kit. So the fun part for me is that I get to deal with all three pieces that we're kind of talking at this conference here today. We have our hardware with the oven, packaged goods with our meal kit, as well as a mobile app that ties it all together in our meal planner. For homegrown, what it means to me, I would say it's having a cohesive brand image and kind of that's authentic to the customer experience you're trying to create, as well as it should all build upon each other. So regardless of whether it was done externally or internally to folks at your company, you want to make sure that it all comes together and presents itself well as one product image. And we can talk about the challenges of getting it to that state.
Tristan.
All right. Tristan Dwyer. I'm a product designer. Currently work at Motional Autonomous Driving. I've been there for about 3.5 years. We make self-driving technology. We're a sort of joint venture between Hyundai and Aptiv. So I work on a lot of the sort of rider experience stuff, the HMI, rider interaction, sort of like, very new type of technology. So sort of unpacking that and making good experiences for people. Prior to that, was also at some other startups in the area. Also been in design agencies or consultancies for about a decade before that. So in terms of what homegrown means to me, I think I've worked with and as a contractor many times. And I think at the end of the day, if you're building a product, what really matters is what the sort of end customer sees. And so something that should feel homegrown and seamless, your customers probably shouldn't really notice any difference between, one feature of your product or one stage of your product or something like that. And not having it seamless could lead to a lot of like confusion or sort of people not enjoying using your product as much. So yeah, I'll pass it to Gwen.
All right, Gwen, how about you?
Hi, folks. My name is Gwen Betts. I am currently the Senior Director of UX at Rapid7. At Rapid7, we make products for cybersecurity practitioners to protect digital networks. I currently run the entire design organization. We're a global team across many different regions of the world. Where I come from too, I've been in tech in some way, shape, or form for over 20 years. I've held positions in IT, customer success, marketing, product design, product management, and also worked very hand in hand with contractors, whether through being in an agency myself or in more established business, startup, you name it. On the question of homegrown, I think Tristan and Sarah, building upon their answers of like, it's cohesive to the brand. It just feels like it works. I'll go a little bit deeper on the product design side of the foundations of how you create a cohesive experience around the user goals, around the information architecture, around interaction design. Like that all comes together and it just works, right? So when we think about homegrown and where there are challenges of why those things don't come together. To me, I think most people think of it from a visual design aspect, but I think of it from the perspective of how does it work? And no matter if you're working with contractors or, fully augmented outsourced teams, you need to get those bones right in order for it to feel homegrown in the first place and in order for it to come together.
Amazing. So we have a question for the audience, and I think we're going to throw up a poll here, and I'll read it for the people that are not logged into the platform and in person here. So just by a show of hands, we want to know, so we can tailor our conversation, where you all are coming from. Are you at the idea stage? Are you at an early stage startup? no surprise, early stage startups in the room. At a scale up, meaning you have product market fit, all right, got a lot of those as well. And, or at an established company. All right, handful. So panelists, take note. That's where we're at. And with that, I'm going to ask our first question to get us kicked off here. How do you know when it's time to outsource some design? And Tristan, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I mean, this is a pretty big, deep topic, but I'll try to be brief. But I think, it's hard to say, if right off the bat, if you were to ask someone, all right, do we need to hire a designer full time or outsource it? A lot can depend on the circumstances, the type of thing you're building, what your sort of goals are, your timelines, things like that. I think if I'm thinking back to the poll here, we had a lot of people in the sort of idea stage. So probably don't have a lot of money to pay someone at that point. So I think, if we think about some of those key factors, right? You have time, goals, you have money, and you have the sort of quality you're trying to get to. So I think when thinking about choosing maybe like, what would be a good fit for an outsourced sort of goal, early on in a company, it might be that you just need an early sort of idea fleshed out, right? It doesn't have to be the best quality. Maybe you don't have a ton of money, but you need something, maybe even for like an investor pitch or something like that. And so there's a lot of companies out there that I've worked with, like Creative Circle or TopTal or other sort of staffing agencies, and they're really good at sort of like helping you find someone really quickly. Versus if you're wanting to invest in like a full-time person, you might, even spend more time really trying to like evaluate fit, and it's less about just getting work in and getting it done quickly and more about trying to find like a longer term solution for your company. So yeah, I think timing and really what your goals are make a big difference.
Amazing. Gwen, Sarah, you have anything?
Yeah, I think I would add to that really quick. In a lot of cases, especially if you, as Tristan highlighted, if you're in the idea stage or early startup stage, I think the big question I would ask too is, what skills do you need? What are the goals, right, of your idea and your startup, and what skills do you need? I think it's safe to say that experience is expected table stakes these days, especially in consumer-driven markets, but even in the B2B space, like users and customers will use, and they do use consumer-driven products, and they just expect a certain amount of polish. So the question I would pose is, how much is experience a differentiator for what you're trying to do? Because that helps you determine, do I, go to bat for hiring full-time, or do I try to hire an agency who can get us off the ground, who can help flesh out these ideas? Or do I hire a contractor who's just going to surface or flesh out some of the initial ideas? And we really don't need someone more long-term. It really just depends on the shape of the engagement and the goals of why you think you need design help in the first place.
And I would also say, if you're able to do it in-house, like if you were here for the prior section, you heard our EVP of Operations, Engineering, and Product talk about, if you're able to build those skills internally yourself, like we don't necessarily have a designer on our team at Suvi, but we have a lot of multi-talented people. And we can fill in those gaps with Figma and designs on the fly on a daily basis, and that often helps us move faster. So also considering, is this a really key feature that you need fully scaled out and maybe you need to outsource to another person? Or is it something that you can fix on the fly with your own internal folks and their skills and capabilities?
Amazing. So how do we balance the flavors of outsourcing, right? Because we have agencies and we have individuals and long-term and short-term. And, when we were talking, Tristan, you had a great example about a particular project where, you had a,
sure. So, it's that thing we were talking about, Dan. So to give an example of actually when we have hired a contractor. So at my current company, we were working on a sort of, think of it as like a new internal tool to our company called RVA, which basically stands for Remote Vehicle Assistant. So our cars are robots. They're not magical devices. They get stuck. We need to unstick them, essentially. And so we had sort of this directive to try to get something off the ground very quickly within roughly like 6 months. So we had some things working, but we wanted to sort of take more functional tool we had and start really investing time into like the UI and making sure like it was really easy for operators to use. At the time, we wanted to hire someone in Singapore. That's one of our big locations at Motional. And I don't know if anyone's hired internationally, but there is this like, 3-month expected sort of like notice period you give. It's not like 2 weeks like it is here in the US. Hadn't hired someone from Singapore so when I found out that, we realized, oh no, we have 6 months, but we're not even going to get someone until at least halfway through. And that's if we happen to know who they are right off the bat. So we began that search long-term for full-time, but we actually reached out to, I mentioned this company earlier, TopTal, and they were able to help us find a designer who was actually really capable, really had like the right skill set and everything within like a week. And we were able to like get him on board. He was able to like basically get us like to that initial goal that we had laid out, but without having to like go through sort of all the hoops that it took to eventually hire the full-time person. Long story short, we ended up hiring that person full-time eventually, but yeah, I think again, it came back down to what we were talking before about like, what are your goals? You have time constraints or other things that factor into that. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and a thing that is a risk anytime you outsource anything, but UI, UX is extremely visible. And so there's a high risk here. I think that puts an onus on us as leaders to make the pieces fit together. And I'd like to kick this one over to Gwen because I know she has a lot of passion in this area. And, how do you make those pieces fit together, Gwen?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, especially around, listen, the reason why often things don't feel homegrown is because things internally go wrong. And there are a lot of things internally that can go wrong to ultimately affect the final product, right? As someone who has hired individual contractors, someone who's hired agencies, as someone who's hired like augmented services, all of the above, the number one advice that I give to folks is the leader and who's ever sponsoring this, you have to own the success. So sometimes you're going to come into situations where you're the sponsor. You need some help, whether it's like somebody's going on parental leave and you need to get a contractor short term, whether you need to expedite a project. I think Tristan's example is a really good one. On the other side, like sometimes you just have, maybe in the previous world, maybe not today, but you have extra money laying around and you can actually accelerate something with an in-house design team. But the core to the success, regardless of what your circumstances are, is you take extreme ownership of the outcome. So that's you, either as the sponsor, or if you are a collaborator to another team who is hiring a contractor or outsourcing in some way, shape, or form, your goal isn't to undermine that contractor regardless of the circumstances. It won't go well for you. It won't go well for anyone else if you're seeing undermining people that are coming in to help the success of a product or a company. And so the first step I always tell people is, on one side, if you are the one sponsoring, you also need to get buy-in from the appropriate parties. I think the first step people think about is like, oh, executives, the people who hold the purse strings are going to give me my money. Yes, and the teams that are going to work with this contractor, this outsourced team, whoever it is. I have several stories, several good and horror stories of where I have gone wrong here. I'll tell you a bad story because I think sometimes you can learn some good lessons from failures or areas where it went wrong. So, a couple of years ago, several years ago now, we had a big initiative at the current company that I'm at where it was a multi-year, multi-pronged strategy across several different milestones to essentially re-envision and redesign the core workflows of our products, right? And we had a small but mighty design team on this product line. It was about 2 to 3 designers and then a UX writer / content designer. They were very focused. I believe in dual track agile, where you have folks focused on discovery and delivery cycles so that they're not pushed and pulled across many different things at once, right? That's also a problem with quality. Now, the problem that I ran into was we had been lucky to get approval on budget because we did actually have some extra budget over by the end of the year. And we thought we could, on the time scale, accelerate and parallelize one of these milestones to release, right? And so we go through the process of writing up the proposal, writing up the scope of work, and we bring in this design team, this design agency, to pair with our design team who's currently working on another milestone. The big challenge that we ran into, though, was the design team, the internal design team, definitely felt very upset about us hiring an external agency, largely because they were really excited about the work. They felt deep ownership. It's all the things you want in an internal design team. The challenge, however, was we didn't do our due diligence to help them understand why we were bringing in an agency to help accelerate the work. And so very early on, one of the things I started to see was these folks were actually not trying to make the agency successful, largely because they wanted to be the ones to do the work, which I totally get. But we had to level set very quickly in order to make this an effective engagement and also show them what an effective engagement was. And so my lesson learned from that too is, you know, you don't have to get necessarily the thumbs up from your design team, but what you do need is to drive consensus and help them understand the why and align it more to like the user and customer success, less about internal team dynamics, but the internal team dynamics that you see are the signals for where you're going to need to dig in potentially.
Yeah, and Sarah, I know that you have a slightly different way, not agency style, like Gwen was talking about, building relationships with contractors at SUV. You care to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we, again, don't really have an internal designer per se, but we work with a lot of fantastic contract designers. And I think something that makes us successful over time is that we try to sustain pretty long-term relationships with a lot of them, so that they continue to come back and build on the designs that they've helped us build to begin with. And that is like a key strategy there to retain them over time, right? And that's where you can then start to put the resources into effectively onboarding them, making sure that they understand the scope of your business, what you're really trying to accomplish, what your key drivers are. And doing that up front pays dividends down the line. Like if they understand what you're trying to do instead of just being handed a brand manual or a design brief, they're going to do far better work for you. And it'll just help them be set up. Another key piece of that, I think, too, that can, you know, go wrong if it's not done right initially is establishing a point of contact for these designers. Oftentimes in startups, like we've kind of been discussing, everyone is involved in the design and the product discussions. Like you want all the greatest ideas coming from everyone on your team and all your customers, but you also want to have a driven direction. And you want to make sure that there is a key person in your company that that designer is working with. And then they also know who to CC for all of the rest of the stuff, right? So that everyone gets drawn into this process. But there's a lot of clarity around what that contractor is doing, their scope of work, and who they should be working with.
Amazing. So we got our contractor. They could be an agency. They could be a long-term relationship. In our discussions when we were talking about this topic the first time, it came up like, what do we need? Like there's the tools, like the literal tools that we need to be collaborative, but you know, how do we set expectations on both sides? That's a key piece, and stories about that I think would really help our audience. Tristan, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I think, you know, especially, you know, with what you were saying about, you know, having like long-term relationships with your contractors. I think, you know, there's one aspect of making sure the design is good. And in order to have that design good, you have to have a good relationship. You have to have a good working relationship. You have to have sort of proper like workflows in place. But one of the biggest things, and I've seen this personally on the contracting side, I used to do a lot of freelancing, and over the, you know, when I started out, it was very much, oh, you need X, Y, and Z. Sure, it'll be this much money. And, you know, that sometimes is good, sometimes blew up horribly. Over time, I sort of learned to start just getting more business-like, essentially, with my engagements. So making sure we have contracts, making sure, you know, payment terms, schedules, deliverables, scope, all that stuff is really like ironed out. I think, yeah, there's this sort of business aspect that, if you want to have the good design work happen and you want that to all be successful, there's the sort of business and logistical things that need to happen sort of behind the scenes. Again, you know, single point of contact, all that kind of stuff really goes a long way. So
I think you can
and-
also, oh,
Go on, Sarah. Go.
I think you can also tactically think about some of the tools you'll use. So sometimes some of our designers can be invited members to channels of our like internal Slack. And that helps us reach out to them and have them available at any time, as well as Figma design libraries. Like if I could go back 5 years ago and tell myself about Figma design libraries, would save myself a lot of heartache. They are fantastic. You should be using them. And it's hard to get, I think, external folks sometimes to use them and build them for you almost, but really emphasizing the importance of that.
Yeah, and I've just add on both to Sarah and Tristan's point, right? Kind of bringing it full circle, coming back to like, what kind of engagement? Why are you outsourcing? What does that engagement look like? Making sure you're drafting the scope of work, as Tristan, you said, like nailing down the scope of engagement as well, even down to, as Sarah said, like contact, but how regularly are you going to communicate? How regularly are you going to have deliverables? Is it expected that you have deliverables, or you're just pairing regularly as if you're an augmented team? So getting those things very solid, I think, really paves the way for a lot of the things you're talking about too, Sarah, right? Of like the bread and butter of design now of, do you have the brand guidelines? Do you have the Figma libraries to be successful? Do you have the knowledge to be successful? But also the how it works, right? Like the design philosophy, do you understand the interaction model that exists that you'll be pairing with? This is where I do think things either go really well or off the rails, and teams who are not as experienced with working with contractors or outsourced folks typically just kind of punt a lot of things over and just say, there you go, you have everything you need to be successful. But that gives, for some folks a little bit too much autonomy. So I think you do have to bring it together in kickoffs and carry that sort of rigor and regular communication throughout the engagement, no matter if it's certain hours a week, it's deliverable focused, or it's somebody who's just working full time with you as a contractor.
Yeah, and maybe can I add one thing too on that sort of, Gwen, you're touching a little bit on the, different types of contractors. So I gave the example a little bit earlier where we were talking about, we hired a full-time contractor to work on our remote vehicle assistance platform. They were sort of, think of it as like an embedded model. There was no really scope per se. We just said, we expect you to be here around 6 months or a year or whatever it was at the time. And obviously, if you're early in building a product, you may not have good insight even what needs to be built until you're already sort of in the thick of it. So that one model of sort of having sort of an on-staff, essentially like an on-staff person who's sort of augmenting your team can be really good if you have a sort of more murky sort of idea of what you're trying to develop. Separately, also at the same time, we had actually worked with a small design agency in the area, maybe 4 or 5 people, and we actually had them work on a whole nother project that really we didn't have sort of like full-time staff to handle in the first place. And that was because that tool was sort of separated from all the other things. It was much easier, and it was a little more of a fixed scope of work. It was much easier to sort of hire them and say, all right, here's the scope, here's the tool we want to build. And we still did, there was still a little sort of flexibility in like how we priced it and how we scoped it, but it was much more like formal. Like every month we get to sort of a checkpoint or a milestone. That's when like a deliverable would be due, payment would be due, et cetera. So yeah, those two different things can or two different approaches can work, again, depending on what kind of project you're trying to undertake.
Yeah, I think that there's like a really interesting question in there, because you gave those 2 great examples, Tristan, and we're talking about design, basically, UI and UX, and it's a creative practice. And there's an obvious tension in how creative we want an outsourcer to be. And how did you negotiate that process with these 2 very different sorts of contractors?
Yeah, absolutely. So there definitely was a difference in terms of sort of design direction and sort of ownership. On the RVA program, we even though it was a little more murky, we did have sort of just like very clear goals of we need to build, X number of these features. Not entirely clear how long they would all take, but we had a little bit more of a sort of ability to sort of like hand those to the contractor and say, all right, we need you to execute on these individual things. Still want to give them sort of like design freedom, but at the same time also knowing that was a little more of like maybe a rigid or sort of fixed kind of project in terms of like what directions we could take it. The other project was much more sort of like brand new reimagining, rethinking. The agency we didn't just do the design, they did all the user research, interviews with our vehicle operators, things like that. And so we sort of, because they were a sort of small team with a couple different functions, they had someone who was a little bit more of like a creative director type, someone who is really more of the hands-on individual contributor designer, and someone who is more of like the user researcher. So we were able to give them a little more full control to sort of propose to us what they thought, like how the product should be shaped and what kind of functionality or features would be like best, bring the best value. Whereas the project with the individual person, we sort of had some of those goals already mapped out. So.
Tristan, I think what you're also highlighting, which I've seen, go really, really well or go off the rails as well, is internally you do need somebody who acts as the creative director that drives cohesion of whatever solutions come out of these teams. Tristan, you described multiple contractors at once, right? Like coming together. And you do want to give some semblance of creative freedom, but your role as the lead or leader of the design team in many cases, and I feel this way about internal teams too, is like you have to make sure it comes together. It's not the failure of a contractor or an agency if it doesn't come together. It's a failure of you not showing extreme ownership. And sometimes I do see tension created around that too. Like it's the way you go about it. It can appear like micromanaging at times, but ultimately like the ownership of the outcome is with the internal team, regardless of if you outsource help, even an embedded model. So I would highly, highly recommend, like in the RACI, for those who are familiar with RACI's, roles and responsibilities, you do designate an ultimate decision maker and creative director who brings it all together. Otherwise, you'll get stuck in some squabbles that aren't fun.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree.
Great. And so when is the right moment to define those roles, I guess, is the question that continues that line of thought. Internally, before you've even spoken to anyone, externally, when you know the contractor that you're dealing with?
I think it's while you're framing the engagement, right? Because I'm sure Tristan and Sarah, you have stories around this, but as someone who's both hired contractors and then contracted myself, when I've contracted myself, it's clear as day when a company or an organization has not actually given deeper thought about the goals, the scope of work, and why they're outsourcing. They almost expect the contractor to figure it out, and or I've seen they try to figure it out as they interview contractors. So I would highly recommend coming back to like, how do you make sure the pieces fit together and owning the success? You do have to actually define that relationship up front and drive consensus across all the collaborators on what that core relationship should be. That's not to say that you can't make it a collaborative process as part of the kickoff, right? But when you're hiring, you should have an idea and have it scoped, like what the relationship is, and then pull that thread through the kickoff with the collaborator teams and people to essentially get to know one another, build trust with one another around that relationship, and then continue to carry that in any sort of operational mechanisms you have in place.
Agreed. I think like it also depends on how your company is scaling and like how the organization is shifting as well. So for right now, as the product manager, most designers do contact me and like I am their point of contact internally. But I've also seen in a prior company at a different startup, as we brought a team in-house and we started adding designers in-house, then the external designers would work with them. So these roles and responsibilities can also shift as you grow.
Amazing. So I think we're ready to open up some questions from the audience if we have any, or we can keep talking about scope. All right, we have one over here.
And just say your name and where you're from and go ahead.
I'm Robin Liss. I'm from SUV. And Sarah, I think a lot of the companies in the audience are probably like seed stage, raised less than $1 million and kickoffs and big scopes, and are just not money they have or should be spending. Would you maybe provide some insight about like how does a small company that might be responsibly spending $10,000 or $20,000, on design in UX, like outsource this tools they can use like Upwork? Like how do you do that and manage that in an affordable responsible way for a company?
Yeah. So I think truly think about like your prioritization list, right? You should start with that. What is the top next feature you need to get out the door that is going to incrementally change your business? And how are you going to go about that? Also, how are you going to test that, right? Because if you're not entirely sure that that's the right direction, do you want to spend a ton of money getting an external designer designing that feature for you? Can you design a quick test first that maybe doesn't have the most beautiful design that anyone's ever seen, but has a sufficient design and gets the idea right, and quickly test and design around that? And a lot of times, again, like I mentioned earlier, that can be done internally. At Suvi, we do have a lot of really talented people in-house that have grown their design skills over the years, although they've never necessarily had the title of designer. And then if you do decide that that is the right feature for you, are you going to scale it up? And is that maybe then the right time to start bringing in a designer to really make sure that it fits seamlessly into the rest of what your website or your mobile app, whatever it is, looks like for you? So yeah, I think you have to go through all the considerations in your head, similar to what Tristan was saying. Do you have the time? Do you have the money? Do you have the team in-house to do these things? And the answer is often no for some of these. So think through those considerations before you launch any project, and then also make sure that as you go through your list of projects, you're hitting the top ones that are important to you, prioritizing them correctly, and seeing if there's any quick tests you can do that doesn't necessarily require you to spend all of that time and money up front. Really validate your ideas first.
I'd love to hop in on this one too, as someone who's both advised at the pre-seed stage. So what I'm hearing too, right? This is why I come back to the question of, is experience going to be a differentiator for your business and product? Because if that's the case, you should make the case for bringing a designer on in the seed stage, right? Like full time. If not, however, that is where you do want to start thinking about how do you outsource potentially? And Sarah, I think you're absolutely right. Like what you described to me was pre-product market fit. The goal of seed to Series A is getting some semblance of idea validation and some semblance of determining early product market fit, not complete product market fit, because that's basically A to B to C, right? And typically you see companies hire designers at the Series A stage for that reason versus, yes, like when you're bringing in seed stage, when you're bringing in your founding team, your people are going to wear a lot of hats because you just do not have the money and, quite honestly, the skills to specialize solely, right? You actually need a lot of people who can do that quick testing and validation and understand that it's about throwing ideas away quickly and learning and getting to that semblance of potential product market fit. And is this a viable business idea? And so when we come back to like, what do you do at the idea stage versus pre-seed? I would also like get involved with these, right? Like stay involved with the startup communities. Like there are tons of designers or design talent that is happy to advise, right? Like in one way, shape, or form. I do it with trusted founders, right? And my network as well. Who are even willing to just like give you ideas of where and how to start and how to think about it. And you can even hire in like a short-term engagement. I've known a lot of idea stage folks who have just like given just a little bit of money for like 20 hours a week. But once you have like seed stage, right, like you can decide full-time hire, or you definitely want to bring in like a contractor agency that is experienced specifically with seed stage startups as well. There are several in Boston as well that are not going to break the bank, and they have certain level of engagements that can be both money and stock oriented as a budget model. But to me, and when I've been successful in those cases, like from idea to seed stage to Series A and beyond, those are kind of the levers that I've used and thought about to get some semblance of design talent engaged that isn't always going to break the bank either.
I'll push back a little bit on the experience thing as well. I think there is also a point later on, maybe you found product market fit, but if you set yourself up right in the beginning, again, going back to those Figma libraries, a lot of times you can spin up a new design based off of your existing design, right? Like part of being seamless is you want to reuse a lot of elements. take those Figma libraries and reuse them. If you're spinning up a new page that's very similar to a prior page, a lot of times, again, with some skill building on your own, you can do that in-house. So also, again, think about how big that feature is that you're trying to push out to market. But a lot of the day-to-day incremental changes that I think I see us making, oftentimes we're able to handle in-house because we've set ourselves up right from the start.
Sarah, on that note, like this is the fun, like PM UX point of view, right? Like,
Yeah.
I 1000% agree. If it's not a net new problem for you to solve, your Figma libraries and your design system are gonna go a long way there. But if you are investing in net new workflows, new conceptual models, that's essentially when you also need to bring in a designer, right? That pairs with your PM.
Yeah, it's a real question of strong systems and how much utility you get out of them and when you're trying to break free. And this is the problem with all design talks is like every question is that it depends. And like, what sort of project are you working on? Who's the right talent? How do we bring it in? And I think that, you know, these are two amazing sides of the story here.
5 minutes.
Great.
And we've got a couple of questions online.
All right, let's have them.
Going with that talent theme, there's 2 questions here, one from Allison, both from Allison. And so one is, any pros and cons in using US-based outsourced talent versus talent located abroad? And then the follow-up on that is, any tips on finding the right outsourced talent or red flags to watch out for?
Yeah, I think I can take this one. So to hearken what Dan said, it depends. So I think, so I've actually worked quite a bit with contractors both in the US and other places, including like Europe. So I think it depends again on the type of relationship you have. You know, some projects are maybe, or some work may be more, say, you know, a marketing piece or something that's a big sort of contained project where someone can sort of run with it. Those things are, I think, a little bit easier to outsource to areas that are not in the same time zone, because it can be a little more of like, here's the thing, they work on it for a while, they come back, you have a meeting, there's a deliverable. For things where, you know, someone's actively working in a team with others or actively sort of iterating on something like maybe your core features in your product, can be done across the world, but certainly much easier to do it on the same time zone just because of meeting times, things like that. If your only option is to work with people on the other side of the world, like I mentioned, we have engineering teams in Singapore at Motional. There's also things you can do to sort of streamline that so that, you know, maybe you trade off. One good thing we've done a lot is trade off meeting times. So we might have a meeting, say Monday night US time, and then the next meeting we'll have, maybe it'll be in the morning US time. So we'll sort of go evening, morning to sort of trade off. That sort of helps, you know, keep people from getting too burned out, things like that, if you're working across a lot of different time zones. Red flags, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head.
People that say they can do anything is probably a red flag.
Yeah. No, yeah. And if you can do it really good and fast and cheap.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think the final point I had there for the idea folks, right? Like at idea stage, as Sarah said, you're just trying to get to a proof of concept, right? Like it is not meant to scale up. And so you can choose talent accordingly based on, hey, if we're just trying to get a viable idea off the ground, like you don't need the quality, you don't need the deep experience of people who know how to scale systems. So I would think about that at the idea and seed stage as well.
I would say with working with international versus US based, you also want to think about your own communication style. If you are working with someone in the US, maybe it's really easy to send them something to read and then half an hour later jump on a call with them and start discussing through it and make sure that they truly understood what you mean, and they can ask all their clarifying questions. If it's international, maybe you don't want to do that. Like there might be a language barrier. They might just not feel as comfortable processing and talking to you live. So find a time of day that you can get on instant message and they can process things like in a written form. I found that that often works better for at least people on our team that are international. They don't really feel comfortable as much talking live in a meeting. So we want to make sure that most of that information gets written down.
Yep. I think those are there, to your point, Sarah, there are cultural implications of communication styles there too. And then this also gets to, if you're, you know, at idea stage or maybe even early startup, you're trying to create the foundations of what your team culture is going to be. So I think those are considerations too for where you outsource and across what cultures potentially.
Did we have one more?
Time for one more quick
right.
question.
Hi, I'm Glenn. First, a quick comment, a plug for in the time zone. Think about Canada and even like Argentina. There's some really good designers in Argentina that, you know, maybe a little bit more affordable. So anyway, think about your time zone, not just US. And a question, do you have different thoughts or perspectives on outsourcing user research or engaging user research, again, in an early stage scenario?
So from a prior company I worked at, I can give a watch out, which is that user research often takes a while. And at a prior company I worked at, it was again, hardware and software, but we engaged someone for user research on hardware project. By the time the user research had wrapped up, we had already hit our gate. Like we had already sent that hardware project to be tooled. It was not going to change at this point, but the research effectively told us that the way that our users were going to use the hardware product was going to be different than we anticipated. And it turned out to be true. Like our users wanted to use it in a different way. And unfortunately, it wasn't designed that way. So also making sure that you build in enough time and you understand, is it a software project? Is it a hardware project? What are the different time scales like with that? And is it going to be more of an agile or a waterfall workflow to make sure that you can effectively time it correctly? A little, yeah.
Yeah, I'll maybe add to that real quick. So, you know, with user research too, if you're thinking about different locations, different countries, also think about, you know, the target audience. So, a lot of good foundational research typically happens in person. So like ethnography type activities. So, if you're an international product, actually that might be necessary to even conduct research in other countries or with people who live in those other countries. But that's just, I think, a big consideration as well, is, you know, what type of research are you trying to do? And is there like a physical component necessary to that?
And I'll extend that one, Tristan, like not just what type of research are you trying to do? Because most people like starting companies, like they actually are not researchers by trade at all. And so it's not even like what type of research and methods, it's what questions do you have and what level of risk and confidence do you have in those questions and what kind of research do you engage them? Big fan, especially for folks who are at idea and early startup stage, like yes, engage a contractor, but Erica Hall's books on Just Enough Research gives you the foundations of doing just enough to mitigate your riskiest assumptions and also drive confidence without necessarily those long time scales that research is often known for. Now, to Sarah's point, like it depends on the space you're in. Sometimes you absolutely need more of those generative or exploratory long research projects or even market research projects. Only you and where you're at in your business are going to know a little bit more about how to apply that. But I think in the idea and early stage, like if it's just about like just trying to get to validating or evaluating riskiest assumptions or confidence, I would highly recommend the body of Erica Hall's work, especially if you really just do not have the capacity to bring a full-time researcher on board.
Amazing. I think that is our time. And so thanks to our amazing panelists and Startup Boston Week and the whole crew that puts on this amazing event, and to all of you for joining us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.